Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Friday, January 3rd. And did you see the news about the South Korean President Yoon recently?
Yeah, the police attempted to arrest him, but there was some army unit that prevented the arrest. That's what I understand. There were also protesters out in front of his residence, and yeah, so they weren't able to execute the arrest warrant, which seems to me actually rather something of a constitutional crisis there in South Korea.
Right, it's pretty wild. South Korea. I've been there a couple times. It doesn't feel like a place where something like this would happen. It's
Yeah,
a very developed, modern, first world place.
right.
So what are your
Very
thoughts on it?
prosperous.
Right, very
Well, okay,
prosperous.
yeah, it shouldn't be forgotten that in the not so distant past, it was a dictatorship. It was a country, run by strongmen all the way up through, the 80s. And I think it was roughly around, 1990 to the early 90s where it began to have regular elections. So it's not so far, from a very different kind of government. And so I guess there's still some of these old habits, but it still is a surprise. It most certainly is. One thing I looked at some pictures of the protesters. There were supporters of the president also out in front of his residence, and several of them were waving American flags.
Yeah, I saw that as well. I
Yeah,
saw some videos, and half of it were American flags, and the other half were Korean flags.
right. So that
It's a
tells you
real
something
mix.
about the orientation of this president and his supporters.
So, how do you think this is going to play out? I mean,
I don't know. I really don't know a whole lot about South Korean politics. Um, yeah, it's interesting though. Um, the coup attempt, the attempted imposition of martial law was a complete surprise, and there is speculation. We have to say it's just speculation, but that the U.S. may have been to some extent involved. Because we can't know this for sure, and anybody says, definitely this was, U.S. sponsored. You got to produce the evidence, um, but. I find it's hard to believe that, the more I think about it and the more I learn about it, it's really hard to believe that the U.S. didn't know what was going on because they have so many connections with the South Korean government. And, they have such a large presence in South Korea, the U.S. military does. There are constant, contacts and meetings between U.S. generals um, and the administration and, the Korean administration and also the Korean generals. So it's hard to believe that the U.S. didn't have a hand in it. And again, it would be the U.S. just has this obsession with hegemony and this Yoon, the president that's trying to hold on and has been impeached, is unusually pro Western.
right? Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to get at a bit. Was do you think that this was a kind of a CIA hatched plot, the whole coup to begin with, the declaring martial law? I'm wondering if the U.S. is afraid that now that they're trying to arrest Yoon, that they might start digging into what happened more, and then to find out that hey, maybe this whole plot was hatched out of the U.S. embassy or something. I mean, that's where my mind is going. I know
Yeah,
we don't know, but
right? We
it's
don't
hard for
know.
me to believe that
Yeah,
it isn't. That
yeah.
it's
I doubt that it was completely hatched in the U.S. embassy, but I would just say that I would be surprised if the U.S. wasn't involved to some extent. But I don't know. You could be right. You really could be right. I mean, this person is so kind of slavishly devoted to the West and especially to American power. And you can, again, what kind of supporters go waving the American flag there in Seoul, South Korea? It's not impossible. It's something that like he feels it's his duty to be a good vassal. I think maybe that's his mindset. And again, the U.S. is used to those kind of leaders in Europe, and they want to have them in Asia as well.
Right. He won't be able to maintain power though, right? This is just a temporary thing. He's just holding off the
Yeah,
arrest, right?
right.
He's
I think he's very unpopular, so it's just like he's bound to lose in the long run. And he did he attempted his coup and it failed. He did have obviously had some support within the military, but it wasn't sufficient. So I think that it's just a matter of time. He's going to have to go.
And if he does go, then I imagine we will probably get some answers then, right? If this
Yeah.
was U.S. involvement, he's probably going to sing, right? He's looking at going to jail for this, right?
Yeah, I don't know the details. I don't know exactly what the penalty is, but we'll find out. Yeah.
Right. It's for me. It's fascinating because we've been focusing a lot on Europe and how the European states are starting to potentially break away, and this could eventually sort of bring down the U.S. empire. But there's other parts of the empire as well that are seeming to fracture a little bit, all the way over in Asia. So it's just interesting development. It just seems like the whole thing is beginning to crack all over our grip on the world, the
Right.
U.S.
Well, I mean, you'd have to say that the grip on Europe is still very tight. Let's be honest. We're seeing, again, the popular sentiment is starting to go, is strongly against, maybe not strongly, but is moving against Western hegemony. You see this rising dissatisfaction. It seems like for obvious reasons in many European countries, but the U.S. maintains a very firm grip. Eventually, and the countries that really broke away, again, Slovakia and Hungary are under attack. They like recently gas cutoff hurt them, and it's going to hurt the reelection chances, I believe. Unless they're able to convince their people that, hey, this is not my fault. We had a good policy and we've been sabotaged. But a lot of people just vote their pocketbooks and say, hey, the economy is getting worse under President Orban. I'm going to vote for the other guy. I mean, a lot of people just don't think very much. They just kind of, like I say, vote their pocketbook. So their positions, they're the real dissidents, the ones that have broken away. But they're small countries. They're surrounded. They're up against a behemoth, and in the European Commission, and the European Commission is clearly out to get them. And I think like this gas cutoff was part of a sort of a war against these countries, a long-term effort to suppress the insurrection and restore unity within Europe.
So you think the decision to cut the gas off, that it was hatched within the EU itself?
Yeah.
Or was this more a Zelensky decision or a
Yeah.
U.S. decision, or
I think
everybody together?
It's all of the above. Yeah, it's clear that Zelensky is very happy about it. I mean, that's very much in keeping with his approach. Again, it hurts probably Ukraine more than any other country. But he is just part of this nihilistic, lashing out at Russia. He declared it was a great victory. We're not getting cheap gas anymore, because they were getting gas. They're also getting the transit fees, which is basically free money. He says, like, no more free money. That was $800 million a year. And then there was also, again, the gas at, very cheap gas. So now we're getting expensive gas, and we lost our free money, and that's a great victory, right? Yeah. So anyway, but that's typical of him. So yeah, I think it's all of the above. The U.S. has actually been waging war on gas pipelines, going all the way from back then. It was the Soviet Union in the 80s. All the way back in the 80s. Since then, when some of these first pipelines were built, including the Druzhba, the one that was recently cut, whose flow was cut, the one that passes through Ukraine. Even back then, the U.S. didn't like it. It was they've always seen it as a priority to cut these economic relations, especially the energy relationship between Europe and Russia. Though it's so obviously to Europe's advantage. and to increase Europe's dependence on the U.S., which again is to Europe's disadvantage. But it's something that makes some sort of cruel geopolitical sense from the perspective of the U.S. It makes no sense from Europe's perspective or Ukraine's, but they've just they've gone along with it. They're converts to Western hegemony, even when it's not to their own benefit.
So this gas that got cut off, was this primarily gas that was headed towards Slovakia and Hungary, just these two countries specifically?
Well, those were the main recipients, is my understanding. Also, Moldova. Moldova, yeah, I just realized I said that. Moldova, but some of it went all the way down to Austria, I believe, and there may be some to Serbia. I'm not sure. So it didn't. And again, as I think we said last time, by cutting this off, you're not only hurting those countries because you have reduced the general supply to all of Europe. And so the whole European market is going to be affected by that. It's going to raise prices. It already has raised prices, through the futures market throughout Europe. And it has an impact actually worldwide. It even has repercussions. Will have repercussions, possibly in the U.S. But yeah, probably gas market, no. But, the oil market, if more efforts are to cut the flow of oil, it will. And the U.S. is trying to do that through those, the sanctions on the shadow fleet. The whole energy market is global. It's interconnected. So it's not, again, I think so many of these European leaders are economically illiterate. So they think, we deprived gas to our enemies, to Viktor Orban and Robert Fico, great victory for us. And they don't understand that by just reducing the general supply, and they reduce it by, I've seen 3.5%, 5%. That's actually, it's a significant amount. And they don't understand that they've reduced it to all of Europe. So all of Europe is going to suffer, including Germany, again, the industrial heartland of Europe. When you're talking about, let's just call it 4%, to pluck a number in the middle of that range. When a market is already tight, you reduce something by 4%, it's going to cause more than a 4% rise in prices. It's just a well-established economic fact. I don't know how much higher it's going to go, but it's going to be significant.
Are there any options for Slovakia or Hungary or just Europe in general in getting other gas or other energy? I mean, this is the lifeblood to any economy is right. Energy, the base input for everything. So what are their options?
Well, their options are, okay, there's only one pipeline that's still functioning, and that's the Turk Stream, which goes through Istanbul. And Russian gas is entering Europe through there. So that will continue. There may be a little excess capacity. They might be able to increase the flow somewhat, but not by very much. And then there's LNG. And the problem is LNG is just considerably more expensive. And they've been buying a lot of LNG. I think their number one supplier is the U.S., but their number two supplier is Russia. So it's really silly. They stopped getting gas from Russia, the cheap gas through the pipelines, and they're buying it. So they're forced to buy more LNG, the more expensive form of gas from Russia. Now you have people, of course, like within the European Commission that are upset that Europe is still purchasing Russian gas. And so
purchasing it directly?
Yeah.
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 So then it's just so stupid.
I know the whole thing. Yeah, I know the whole thing is so stupid, but it's just beyond stupid. And it's self-destructive. It's just like it's almost like you're talking about somebody, a mental patient that has some sort of self-harm impulse, right? This is, what are you doing? Are you depriving yourself of the lifeblood of your own economy? It's like you're kind of slitting your own arteries and watching the blood flow out. It's the same kind of behavior. So yeah, they are getting LNG from Russia. It's a significant amount, but there are powerful people in the European Commission and in European governments that want to see that end. And so they may do that too. And then, the prices will rise that much higher.
That's wild.
Yeah. And
How does the EU, can you explain the power of the European Union itself? Like, how does it exactly threaten these countries? It's able to make a decision just like this collectively, like we will no longer buy any gas at all from Russia. They're able to do that blanket wholesale for all of Europe.
Well,
isn't there autonomy for each country?
Yeah.
Can't they work out their own deals?
Yeah. That's what happened is that the EU tried to actually stop buying all Russian gas, pipeline gas, and they had this great sanctions package and a series of them. But what happened was the Slovakia and Hungary said that we're not going to go along with this. We're not going to vote for these packages if you don't make an exception for our countries. And so, the EU agreed to make an exception, for those two countries. And so they had been receiving a fair amount of Russian gas. Now, it's sort of like it's supposed to be unanimous, but the thing is, they also have a lot of levers. When you do something, like Hungary has angered the EC. They are just the people there hate Orban with a passion and want to bring him down, and they can do things. They can. For example, I think they just recently stopped providing grants to that Hungary had a right to, according to EU agreements. We're talking about a substantial, amount of money that was going from Brussels to Budapest. And that has been cut off, because they say it's because he didn't carry out certain court reforms and other things, and so they're penalizing him. But I think the main thing is that he's just been disobedient, especially vis-a-vis Russia. So they can do things like that to hurt these countries, and these countries are greatly dependent on Brussels in a lot of ways.
So is the main power kind of the ECB then, the European Central Bank, that they can cut off funds or funding to countries? Yeah. Is that the main?
I haven't actually heard that the ECB has played a role, but I suppose that potentially it could. It's just been the EC directly. We're not talking about loans. We're talking about direct grants.
So the EC is the European Commission?
The European Commission. That's correct. Okay. Yeah, that's what the European Commission in Brussels.
Okay, and they can just make decisions on any member state within the European Union on just say we're not giving you...
You have to go through certain bureaucratic procedures. It takes some time, but they do it. Yeah, and they have recently cut off, the flow of funds to Hungary, and so that puts Orban under a lot of pressure. It really does. And
could that not push these countries more into BRICS and closer to Russia? I mean,
well, there's the potential for that. It just, with Hungary, they're so deeply embedded, these countries that are already members, it's hard. You develop a dependence. It's kind of like, the states within the United States that used to be semi-sovereign, even after the Civil War. And they're not really even semi-sovereign now because all the states have become dependent on federal largesse. And I think it's the same thing within the EC or the EU. It's going to be hard. I mean, it's not impossible. It's going to be hard. Now, a country like Georgia, which hasn't joined, they still have as their stated objective to join. Their stated objective is to join the EU. But I think in truth that they are going to start looking at BRICS and after their experience over the last year or so, and they can because they haven't made themselves dependent on the EU, so they can. I think they, if they're wise, they will try to solidify their ties with the other powers, with the BRICS countries.
Right. I imagine the Georgians are furious with the West, the majority of them. after what's happened. And I imagine the Slovaks and the Hungarians, most of them probably realize what's happening.
Yeah.
You know, you see the Western headlines, Russia cuts off gas to Europe. Well, but I think everybody knows that it was Ukraine and the US and the EU that
Right.
made this decision to cut off gas to themselves and specifically targeting Slovakia and Hungary. So if you're a Hungarian, I'd be furious. And,
Yeah.
you know, I'm sure they are. And I'm sure Viktor Orban and Fico have to be livid.
Yeah.
And they might just say, you know what, we're done with EU. You know, we're
Yeah.
out. We're moving
Yeah,
away.
well, potentially. I haven't heard any of those murmurings yet. But yeah, I can imagine if I was a citizen of one of those countries, say like, what kind of, this is supposed to be about mutual benefit. We joined this because, we're supposed to be part of a club where we help each other out. And it turns out that in fact, we're penalized. We're having our, our economy is being ruined by this deliberately, by the leadership of this club that we've become a member of. And
Right, and
say,
quite openly.
what kind of club is this? Who wants to be a member of that club? It's just like you go there and you get a beating or something.
Right. Well, it just seems like every decision that the West makes seems to backfire. So I'm just wondering how this is going to play out. It just seems like such a bad decision. First, it's hurting your own economies. It's going to further add fuel to the dissident parties that you're afraid of. I mean,
Right. I saw today just on that topic. It was the head of the AfD. That is, AfD again is really the largest political party in Germany now. Has declared that if they take the reins of power, they will repair and reopen and I guess it was never actually opened, but they will repair and put into operation Nord Stream 2.
Okay.
And so that must be one reason why they are the leading political party in Germany. I think most Germans say, yeah, please.
Right. Turn the lights back on. Let's get the heating going again. Let's get industry moving. It's just such basic common sense. It's just it's unbelievable. You're strangling the economic growth of your own country purposely. And then one country says, hey, how about we, turn the lights back on and get things moving again? It's like, of course you want to vote for those people.
Right.
So what would happen if the AfD won? Because that election's coming up pretty soon, right? I believe in February.
Yeah, well, I think they almost certainly will win. They will get more votes than any other party, but they won't get a majority. And so they will not be able to form a government unless some other political party agrees to work with them. And unfortunately, at the present time, that's just not going to happen.
What if Sarah Wagenknecht, their leftist party, do you think that's possible?
Well, I think they, unfortunately, and I wish they would, they have their own reasons. They too don't want to work with the AfD. In fact, the two parties do overlap on a lot. I think they have a fair amount in common, but there's this leftist allergy towards, the right wing, so-called. And also, I don't think that Sarah Wagenknecht's party is actually doing very well. There's a chance that they might fall out of, they may fall below the threshold to have representatives within the Bundestag.
Okay, well, let's assume if by some chance they do get a majority, what would that do to the EU and just the Ukraine war, everything?
I don't know. That would just, it would create shockwaves, and there would probably, maybe we'll see something like we saw in Romania where a court just annuls the election and say we can. Who knows? I mean, really, because that's what we've seen, right? There wasn't any tisk-tisking, wagging of fingers in Brussels when Romania did that. There was just complete silence, and if there were any expressions of, any expressed opinions about it, they were expressions of support. And so, it just reveals the way they think. Their idea of democracy is the right party wins and the wrong party wins, and we shut it down. That's democracy, so-called, See, it's at some point they won't even try to call it democracy, but like.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I feel like this move is going to further boost the AfD, and it's possible by February that maybe they can even get a majority. And then you can't annul the German elections too big. Romania, not, a lot of people don't know anything about it. Kind of just falls out of the news. You don't talk about it. But you're not going to be able to hide something like that in Germany.
Yeah, no, it would be a very major event. It would be a political earthquake in Europe.
Yeah. Can you tell me?
You know, it's possible. I mean, both the National Rally in France and the AfD in Germany have been growing in size and power influence, you know, over the last many years, and they are, you know, they're not there yet, but they are approaching majority status, and I think one or the other eventually may get there.
These people that oppose the positions of like the AfD or the National Rally in France, are they? What is fueling them? Because it seems so obvious to us, and I feel like to most people, that the policies that these other the parties that are currently in power are not doing anything in the interest of their own country. It seems like it's just a hatred of Russia, and they're just destroying their own economies, hurting their own people, moving towards authoritarianism. Where is that? How do people rationalize this? You know, if the AfD can't get a majority, do you really think that the majority of Germans are supportive of the sort of the current establishment?
Yeah, well, it seems to be the case. You know, a thin majority, if that, and it's the same thing. It's a shrinking majority and may soon cease to be a majority. But you have a lot of people that just have this instinctively trust the establishment. You know, it was also true in this country, and yeah, a lot of things really don't make sense to them. They have they feel that things are moving in the wrong direction, but it's just like they feel it's their duty to support, you know, the people in power, and the people in power are telling them that the AfD is very dangerous, or the National Rally, that they're crypto fascists, and you know, if they're elected, they're going to start you know, rounding people up and sending them to concentration camps and that kind of thing. In fact, if you look at the policies, I think, of either of these parties, they're like typical, really like maybe center-right policies from 25 years ago. It's nothing far right or scary. That, you know, it's nothing like pre-World War Europe. But that's the, you know, that's the fears that the establishment works hard to create. And it seems to be effective for a lot of people who just really don't bother to look beneath the surface, and to be honest, don't really seem to have a kind of a mind of their own on these issues. But but you know, as things get worse, as conditions continue to deteriorate, it's going to be harder and harder for the establishment to hold on. You know, Europe's had a good long run of being a very, very prosperous part of the world. And so there's this residue of just sort of trust. Hey, this is a system that works. You know, these guys have been in power since 1945, and we've really done quite well. Yeah, there's some problems now, but we got to stick with them. And they're telling us that these people over here are very, very dangerous. You know, we better not. But I think, you know, as the establishment continues to go down this self-destructive path, conditions will deteriorate, and they'll deteriorate to a point where those kind of people are actually going to take the plunge and say, this isn't working. There's something wrong here. I'm going to cast my vote for the AfD or for the National Rally.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see that election.
Yeah,
I'm always kind of,
and some of them
I'm always
for,
optimistic.
Yeah, for true dissident leftist parties, like, you know, Mélenchon in France, and then, you know, Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about Transnistria? I've been seeing that a lot in the news, and I thought I knew Europe pretty well, but I never heard of Transnistria until you mentioned it a few times, but I never really asked you about this region in this area. So can you tell me what Transnistria is and what's currently going on there?
Okay, yeah, it's a strip of land in northern that borders Ukraine and northern Moldova, and it is the people there are basically Russians. I don't really know how it happened, but there was it broke away from Moldova. Not entirely. It's still considered part of Moldova, but it has, has a great degree of autonomy. And I think the Russians have a military presence there, not a very large one. They have there's an old Soviet, arms depot there. It's huge. It has it's maybe the largest one from the remaining from the Soviet era. And most of those weapons aren't all that useful, and the ammunition there is not all that useful, but it potentially could be, still any kind of weapon, even if it's not top notch, can serve a purpose in a war. So at various times there have been fears that the Ukrainians might actually try to attack Transnistria and take that depot. And a lot of people have speculated that the Russians are aware of this possibility and have wired the place to explode if that happens. And so, rather than let the Ukrainians get their hands on it, they might just blow it up. But yeah, there are quite a few people there, and they've been hit badly by this recent gas cutoff. Apparently it's just like basically all their industry had to just stop working on January 1st, came to a halt. So they're in a real crisis. Now, they're a pretty good distance from the Russians. Transnistria is not that far from Odessa. It's to, the west of Odessa. But if the Russians ever do, and I think they probably will, cross the Dnieper and march on Odessa, I think they'll go all the way to Transnistria. And so that eventually Transnistria will have, a direct border. It would be, for all intents and purposes, a part of Russia again. But that may be, who knows, a year or 2 years, 3 years in the future. In the meantime, there's a real open question about how it's going to survive. Moldova overall is in a real fix, but Transnistria in particular, because the current government is very, very hostile towards Transnistria. And, they generally if they can make life harder for them, they do it. And the recent elections, they actually, they actively suppressed votes from Transnistria as they did for, Moldovans living in Russia. And there are many, many Moldovans that live in Russia, but they made it very, very difficult for them to vote in both Transnistria and in Russia. So again, they kind of regard those places as hostile territory. They do regard them as hostile territory.
Could it be a potential flashpoint then, do you think? I mean, you said there's that
potentially
depot and there's a...
Yeah, no. I think it's something that there have been, again, occasionally there are rumors, there will be a flurry of rumors that the Ukrainians are preparing something, like they may, they're going to make a move on Transnistria. And if they did, they might do it with Moldovan support, with the Moldovans coming from the other side. I think there's always the risk. You can see, it's just the Ukrainians are desperate, and they'll do anything that could maybe expand the war. And that's a possibility. That would be a way to expand the war. The Russians might feel that they have to intervene, but then they can say, hey, the Russians have now invaded Moldova. Who knows?
Well, it'd be Ukraine that would have invaded Moldova.
Yeah, but it would be Ukraine first. But that never bothers anybody. Just like you can say it was Ukraine that maybe started the war in eastern Ukraine. It was their effort to take those provinces by military force that began the war back in 2014. But of course, that's never how it's explained. It would be the same thing with Moldova. If the Russians intervened after a Ukrainian incursion or something, it would be blamed entirely on the Russians, and it could be used as a justification again for bringing NATO forces into direct conflict with Russia. That's the potential, but it may be, who knows, and who knows what's going on behind the scenes. Again, it just may be that the Ukrainians might want to do that, but NATO might not want that to happen. Again, it seems clear to me that actually NATO, the U.S. in particular, is not eager to have a direct conflict with Russia.
Is Moldova part of the EU or NATO?
No, it's not part of the EU, and I don't think it's part of NATO either. In the recent election, there was actually some kind of referendum on joining the EU, and it won just barely. But it won because actually within Moldova itself, it lost. But it won because of a great number of votes that came in from Western Europe. Moldovans that are living and working in Western Europe. Now, if that had been counterbalanced by the many, many Moldovans that live in Russia, I think almost certainly it would have lost. But there was just, blatant voter suppression in Russia. So, yeah, they haven't become part of the EU yet, but that's the clearly stated goal of the current government.
How can the Moldovans suppress votes in Russia? Like, can't the Russians help them set up voting booths, or
no?
I guess that would be election interference.
Yeah, right. They can't. Yeah, what happened is that there are a lot of Moldovans in Russia, and they're spread throughout Russia. They simply allowed, a voting center. They opened up a voting station in the embassy in Moscow, and that was it. And it was just, whereas I can't remember the number, but we're talking about many, many, many dozens in Western Europe. So, it was very blatant. It wasn't like, there's just a few more in Western Europe. No, it was, it was clearly an effort to minimize votes coming from Russia and to amplify votes coming from Western Europe.
All right, I'll change topic. Well, I'll kind of keep it tied in a little bit. Did you see, I'm sure you saw the news about the Cybertruck bomber.
Yeah.
And that he served in Ukraine.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts about some things like this?
Yeah.
And we also had the attempted assassination on Trump was also somebody that was very, very pro-Ukraine, anti-Russia. Right. To me, it seems like it's kind of proof that there's more involvement from the U.S. armed forces in Ukraine, and they are feeling that desperation. And I was just kind of thinking, I'm trying to understand from their point of view, and I realize that if you're over there with the Ukrainians and you're fighting the Russians, and you've lost 600,000 people have died, maybe more, who knows? You've seen all this bloodshed. You feel like it can't be for nothing. It's just such a heartbreaking thing, as you have to believe that you're in the right, that you're fighting for the right cause. And it just can push people to do crazy things. It's a sad state of affairs that I just wonder how, do you think it's just these people trying to cope with what's happening in Russia, and then it leads them to try to do some terrorist attack? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think your explanation makes sense. Again, when you're talking about these individuals, they're generally unbalanced. So it's not entirely rational, but I don't think an assassination attempt is ever rational. It's emotion driven, and I think, your explanation holds water. I think also in general, like the other one, the one that attempted the assassination in Florida, I don't think he had ever been to Ukraine. Maybe I'm not remembering that correctly. I don't think he certainly wasn't involved in the fighting.
He wasn't fighting, but he was doing kind of
he wasn't involved
promo
in
videos, kind of recruiting and PR stuff. Yeah,
right. But there is so much demonization of Russia and idealization of Ukraine. It's just that for a lot of people, it really does become this battle between good and evil. It's just black and white, and how can we have to stand by these people? How can we have and they hear again. I don't really think policies are going to change in a significant way, but if you listen to the media, you have the sense that that it's almost a certainty that that Trump is going to impose some sort of unfair, unjust solution on Ukraine, or he's just going to, pull the plug on the effort. And the poor Ukrainians who have fought so bravely are going to be overrun by these evil hordes. And, yeah, I think that's really what exists in their mind, and explains the extreme actions that they take.
Right. I just feel like this war, it's different than comparing it to things like, World War II when the Germans surrendered or the Japanese surrendered. I just don't see this really ending, especially if we are seeing kind of a trend for Ukraine to move more towards terrorism. Like if they stop at the Dnieper, for example, I just feel like there'll be so much animosity in Western Ukraine. I mean, everybody in Western Ukraine they personally probably know somebody that died in this conflict, or has fled or has been wounded. There's just going to be so much anger and angst, and to think that all this was for nothing, not more than nothing. Like, we could have had all of Ukraine if we just agreed to the deal, before. And
that's the way they should think. I mean, because that's true. Actually, it would be best if the Minsk Accords were put into effect. They wouldn't have even lost the Donbass. They would have had all of Ukraine. And so it's just with every deal that was torn up or rejected, and there's the current offer of the 4 oblasts, that too is being rejected. Their situation gets worse and worse. And the rational thing is to look, we took a wrong turn. We got to make a correction now. We lost all that. We're going to lose even more. Let's accept the deal. But they can't do that. It's like you said. It's just that, when you've sacrificed so much for something, you just can't tell yourself that you were wrong. It's hard to admit that those 600,000, or who knows really how many died.
Right. That your son, your brother, your husband,
nothing. They died in vain. It was for nothing. It was stupid. They died for a stupid government, and it's really hard to come to terms with that. So you need to believe in it, and then so the government takes advantage of that and says, we've got to keep on fighting. We will turn this around, and so you just want to believe that. And obviously, fewer and fewer people within Ukraine are believing it. That's what the polls show. But there still is a core, and they still have. It's still these ultra nationalists who are, they're committed to a fight to the death. For them, it's like death is preferable to surrender, and those are the people that unfortunately run the country. I think the average Ukrainian doesn't think that way and really would like to see this come to an end, but they don't have any say in the matter. It's the ultranationalists that are setting the policy and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I also saw something about recently that they're going to be lowering the conscription age to 18. Do you know if that's been confirmed?
Yeah, I've heard rumors about that, let's say, over the last few weeks, and they seem to be intensifying. And I think that's probably what's going to happen. And I think the Ukrainians know that that's probably what's going to happen, which is why a lot of 16 and 17-year-old boys have been leaving the country over the last few months.
I mean, this has to be a pretty unpopular decision, right? Do you think this could...
Well, that's why Zelensky obviously was so reluctant to do it. But I think he's been pressured by the West for months now, and I think he probably has already relented, and we're going to see that conscription of 18-year-olds begin soon.
Do you think that could cause some, rumblings of revolution? I just wonder how much more the Ukrainian people can take. I mean, I really feel bad for them.
It's really awful. It's a terrible situation. It really is.
Right. I mean, just a whole generation of Ukrainians have died, and I think a lot of people kind of want to. And the problem with war is people will get into this just mindset of cheering when you inflict damage on the other side, and you forget kind of just the human loss. That a lot of these people are just they've been indoctrinated to a certain extent, but I mean, who knows? I mean, especially if you're if you're a kid, 17, 18 years
Yeah.
old, you don't know better. It's easy to
Yeah,
get
right.
indoctrinated.
Yeah,
I would have probably been too.
right,
It's just,
right. Every 17 and 18-year-old is essentially doesn't really have his own thoughts. I mean, let's be honest. Or it's very, very rare. It's just that you believe what you're told.
right. Yeah, it's such a tragedy. I hope it comes to an end soon. But like you said, it just seems like we just keep on. It just, I feel like we really will push them to the last Ukrainian. We'll fight to the last one. Don't you think that this has to end soon? I mean, it can't. You're getting down to scraping the bottom of the barrel. I've also been seeing reports of more mass desertions on the front. I just don't see it how it can keep going.
Yeah.
How can they keep getting? How can they keep doing this? It's so
right.
evil.
It's amazing that actually it's gone on as long as it has, and there has been it seems like a steady deterioration in morale and an increase in desertions, and that eventually that will become completely unsustainable. It's hard to say when. You even have some Ukrainians say that maybe we have 6 more months, and then we've been using the word collapse, but I think we're still not at the collapse. There is a crumbling, there is an acceleration in the Russian advances. There's an obvious weakening and also lowering of morale on the Ukrainian side. But they're still fighting. Especially in certain places like Kursk, Seversk, even in the southern Donbass, they're not putting up much of a defense, but they're still putting up a defense. The Russians still have to proceed. They proceed steadily. They take like a village or two every day, at least. But they have to proceed cautiously. There's still those drones, not as many as there used to be. And they come to find ways of defending against them, but you still have to be careful. But if eventually, I think there really will be a collapse, and we're probably going to see it in a true collapse. Where it's just like okay, there's just nothing there. The resistance is gone. They just turn, and it's not just like a couple hundred men from this battalion or this brigade, or a couple hundred from that other one that desert, but entire brigades just turn and flee, and then we have a true collapse, and then the Russians will be able to just march unimpeded. We're not there yet, but we may see it. I mean, because that's the course that we're on. It's just a steady. If you look at a graph, you see Ukraine is just steadily weakening, and Russia is growing in strength. And there's some point where that gap becomes so big that there just isn't really even a war anymore. There still is a war. Obviously, they can still fight, and the Russians have to be cautious, and they are. That's the thing is, I think a lot of people, including some kind of generally pro-Russian military analysts, are frustrated with the Russians. They say, if they took more risks, they probably could bring this war to an end sooner. But Putin he's risk averse. And he's actually, I think it's clear, in spite of everything you hear in the West, that he's actually very concerned with conserving Russian lives. And, and I'm sure the parents of all these young men who are out there are very grateful for that. So it's not until where there's, as long as they can kill Russian soldiers in significant numbers, the Russians are going to proceed cautiously, even if it's steady. It's actually, we're talking about 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers a day. It's not going to be, a rapid movement across the steppe until that resistance just completely caves in. And I think we may see that this year. I think we probably will.
When we hear about these desertions, where are they deserting to? Is it a desertion, or are they defecting, or are they surrendering? I mean, what?
Some are surrendering, clearly, and I think that's gone up, but not that many. I'm surprised, and it may be the effects of it. Just may be very difficult and dangerous to surrender, when you're on the front line, and there is a chance. I know it happens. I've seen the videos that sometimes men that surrender on the Ukrainian side actually get shot by their fellow soldiers or by some unit that's behind them. That happens. So for whatever reason, or maybe it's just propaganda, a lot of them have been brainwashed, convinced that the Russians are going to torture them or something. There haven't been that many surrenders. There certainly, I think it's clearly on the increase, but the desertions are very common. There was recently a story that appeared, I think it was maybe the BBC, it was a major Western media outlet. It was supposed to be an elite brigade, I think the 155th, that trained in France, and they got the best equipment, Leopard 2 tanks, and and this was supposed to be an elite group. 1,500 of them deserted before they even got to the front lines. And then the whole thing, it just became a joke because, okay, we don't have hardly any of the men that we're supposed to have. We'll just grab this guy who got out, we grabbed him on the street a week ago, and we'll just put him in there. And it ended up being a total disaster. They didn't accomplish anything immediately. A lot of them, when they did get to the front lines, immediately turned and fled or, hardly put up a fight.
Right. So that's my question, though. What if they deserted? You have a group of 1,500 armed men that are doing what? That are where?
Well, some of them I'm sure have crossed the border. Some of them are hiding in basements. Some of them.
When you say cross the border into where?
Romania. That's Hungary. I think those are usually their destinations. Okay,
so they're just flooding into Western Europe.
Yeah, I don't know if it's fair to say flooding, but they're the ones that can get there. It's difficult. The borders are guarded, but they do it. They especially this time of year. There are mountains and rivers to cross, and it's a dangerous trek. Yeah, and some of them, quite a few, have died in the process. Of attempting to escape this country.
But I mean, if you're closer to the front, I mean, there's no way you're making it all the way over Romania or Moldova.
I don't know.
So
that's crossed my mind too. It's something that we need to look into. Where do they just go back home? But then you would think that the Ukrainians would
arrested, shot.
Yeah. Well, I haven't. Some of them do get shot. Some of them do get killed or beaten to death. A lot of them are thrown into prison, or maybe they're just sent back to the front. I don't know. It's actually a good question.
Right. Yeah. Because I've been hearing about those desertions. I'm like, well, they can't just kind of go back home and start playing Xbox or something. They have to.
You wouldn't think so. Yeah.
Right. So I was thinking that maybe they're going over to the other side, maybe not fully defecting, but going over on the Russian side, and then they'd be able to give a lot of intel to the Russians as well, and it would further expedite just the end of the war. I guess we were just speculating now, so we don't have to further.
Well, there's something to keep our eyes open for and see if we can find out more what's happening, where these people are going.
Right. Okay, well, I think we can wrap it up here unless there's anything else you want to talk about.
No, I think that's a good place to end.
Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Dad. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.